Welcome to The Explainer. Let's just dive right in, shall we? Today, we're uncovering the absolutely incredible true story behind the margaritas, the parades, and all the parties. When we think of Cinco de Mayo, we instantly picture this vibrant, fun celebration of Mexican culture. But the actual history that birthed this holiday? Man, it is a gripping tale of underdogs, massive imperial ambition, and a single battle that literally altered the course of history for two different nations. So let's strip away the modern festivities for a minute and travel back to the 1860s. Now, I want to start off with a question that represents, without a doubt, the most common misconception about this holiday. I hear it literally all the time. People just assume that because it's such a massive celebration here, it must be Mexico's Independence Day, right? Like, it's just the equivalent of the 4th of July. Well, let's take a look at the actual facts. Time for a quick reality check. Mexican Independence Day is actually celebrated on September 16th. That date commemorates the famous 1810 Cry of Dolores, which was this massive call to arms that kicked off a grueling 11-year war for independence from Spanish control. And that is, for sure, Mexico's most important patriotic holiday. So, if May 5th isn't about independence from Spain, what exactly are we celebrating? Well, to understand that, we need to look at the incredibly precarious situation Mexico found itself in just a few decades later. The build-up to this whole conflict started around 1857. A brutal civil conflict called the Reform War broke out in Mexico, and it left the nation absolutely devastated, like completely financially bankrupt. By 1861, the newly elected president, Benito Juarez, looked at the country's completely empty coffers and made a desperate, fateful decision. He suspended all payments of foreign debts for 2 years. Basically, Mexico simply didn't have the cash to pay its European creditors. And as you can probably imagine, those creditors did not take the news lightly. That single financial decision triggered a huge international crisis, leading straight into a foreign invasion in 1862. The immediate fallout was pretty severe. In late 1861, a tripartite expedition of heavily armed fleets from Great Britain, Spain, and France showed up in Veracruz to basically collect their money by force. President Juarez desperately negotiated with them. He somehow managed to convince Britain and Spain that starting a war would just guarantee they'd never see a single dime. So they packed up and went home. But Emperor Napoleon III of France, he decided to stay. With the U.S. entirely distracted by its own civil war, he saw a golden opportunity to conquer Mexico and carve out a brand new pro-French empire right there in the Americas. And the French were incredibly confident about this. General Charles de Lorenzes marched a formidable army straight toward Mexico City, setting up this classic David versus Goliath showdown. Just picture this. On one side, the French Empire, 6,000 elite, highly trained soldiers armed with state-of-the-art rifles. And on the other side, the underdogs, Mexican General Ignacio Zaragoza commanding a ragtag, heavily outnumbered force of maybe 4,500 loyal men armed with, frankly, antiquated muskets. Actually, the French were so arrogant, so absolutely confident in their superiority that a bunch of their soldiers didn't even bother to properly assemble their weaponry before the battle. They honestly thought it would be a walk in the park. What's really fascinating here is the strategic location. Zaragoza was smart. He knew he couldn't beat the French out in an open field, so he heavily fortified the town of Puebla, specifically using the high ground. Up at the fort of Guadalupe, which sat on a hill overlooking the city alongside the fort of Loreto, the French commander made a truly critical tactical error, and it was rooted in pure arrogance. He was actually advised to bypass the forts entirely, but General Lorenzes instead ordered a direct, uphill assault against the absolute strongest point of the Mexican defense. He believed that the second those forts fell, the Mexican morale would just completely shatter. So the crucial turning point is what went down on that specific day, May 5th, 1862, the Battle of Puebla. Right at noon, the French artillery opens fire and they just shell the forts for hours, but the Mexican defenders hold firm. Next, the French send in their elite infantry for a grueling uphill assault. Boom, they're repelled. They try a second time, routed again. By the third assault, the French artillery is basically running out of ammo, and then the weather steps in. A heavy rain starts dumping down, turning the whole hillside into the slick, impassable mud pit. Seeing the French infantry slipping around and retreating, General Zaragoza seizes the moment. He orders his Mexican cavalry, led by a young, brash general named Porfirio Diaz, to counterattack right in the pouring rain. The orderly French retreat just turns into an absolute rout. The mighty French army is literally forced to flee the battlefield. Look at this number right here, 460. That is the estimated number of French soldiers who were killed or wounded on that single day. By stark contrast, the Mexican forces lost only 83 men. It wasn't just a victory, it was this stunning, highly disproportionate defeat of one of the world's premier military machines by an outnumbered, under-equipped force. Just incredible. Right after the rout, General Zaragoza sent a dispatch to President Juarez in Mexico City, and it contained this now legendary phrase: "The national arms have covered themselves in glory." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. President Juarez was so thrilled he immediately declared May 5th a national holiday to commemorate the mind-blowing bravery shown at Puebla. But here is a vital piece of context we have to keep in mind. Did this crazy victory actually end the war? No. France simply regrouped, shipped over an overwhelming 27,000 reinforcements a year later, and ultimately did capture Mexico City, installing an Austrian Archduke, Maximilian, as Emperor of Mexico for a few years. But from a strategic and emotional standpoint, the Battle of Puebla was a monumental morale boost. It showed the Mexican people and the entire watching world that the French were not invincible. It proved that sheer determination and courage were incredibly powerful weapons, and it really galvanized the resistance that would eventually drive the French out of Mexico completely by 1867. Okay, now let's pivot for a second and look at the wider map. Because you have to ask, how did this underdog Mexican victory impact the United States Civil War? Remember, in May 1862, the U.S. is totally tearing itself apart, and you might be surprised to learn that Zaragoza's victory heavily influenced American history. Let's look at the geopolitical ripple effect here. The French Emperor Napoleon III was actually quietly sympathetic to the Confederate South. The French were hoping to circumvent the Union naval blockade by shipping long-range artillery overland through Mexico, right into Texas, and straight to the Confederate armies. But Zaragoza's victory at Puebla stopped the French dead in their tracks, delaying their advance to the Texas border by a full year. By the time the French finally secured control of that border in the summer of 1863, the Union Army under General Ulysses S. Grant had already won the massive, decisive Battle of Vicksburg. That effectively cut off the Confederates' access to weapons from the West. So by handing the French a surprise defeat, the brave soldiers at Puebla essentially denied the Confederacy a vital global ally. They very well may have saved the Union. So how in the world did we get from a 19th century battlefield to the massive celebrations we see today? The evolution is fascinating. Almost immediately in the 1860s, Mexican immigrants and Union supporters over in California began celebrating the victory, totally recognizing its importance to the Union cause. Fast forward to the 1930s, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy deliberately promoted the holiday to foster better relations with Latin America. Then, moving into the 1950s and 60s, the holiday took on a whole new life when Chicano activists in the U.S. embraced Cinco de Mayo as this really powerful way to celebrate their heritage, their roots, and their resilience. Which brings us right up to today. What's super interesting is that Cinco de Mayo is actually celebrated much more widely in the United States than it is in Mexico. Down in Mexico, outside of the state of Puebla, where they still hold military parades and reenactments, it's honestly largely a regular day. But here in the U.S., it has evolved way beyond the specifics of the battle itself. It's become this massive, joyful celebration of Mexican culture, heritage, and that enduring spirit of an underdog overcoming completely impossible odds. So the next time May 5th rolls around, absolutely go enjoy the food, the music, and the celebration of this beautiful culture. But as you do, I challenge you to look just a bit past the modern festivities. Will you remember the 4,500 brave, outgunned soldiers standing in the mud at the Fort of Guadalupe? These were men who stared down an elite empire, defended their homeland, and in doing so, unknowingly changed the course of 2 entire nations. It's an incredible story of true courage. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep learning.